colleagues, thank you for coming in what is almost considered holiday season in Germany. But we have an extremely distinguished speaker this afternoon, Professor Dan Bromley. He is Anderson-Bascom Professor Emeritus of Applied Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. He's also currently visiting professor at Humboldt University in Berlin. What brings him currently to Germany is a very distinguished prize, the Reimar Lüst Prize from the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung. Alexander von Humboldt Foundation gave him this great award. Professor Bromley focuses on the institutional foundations of the economy, legal and philosophical dimensions of property rights, economics of natural resources, and broadly speaking, economic development, and all sorts of conflicts related to the topics which I have just mentioned. Professor Bromley is a very important and senior advisor. What I learned was, and didn't know then, that you were also involved recently with the government of national unity in Sudan. There are lots of African colleagues here in the room. And that you also focused on issues such as development strategy in Iraq, so you don't shy away from complex environments. I believe this is your first visit to ZEF, long overdue. We follow your writings carefully. The more than a dozen important books which you have published hopefully are all in our library, and not only in the library, but we know that people are reading you, especially those of us and our students and our senior researchers who focus on institutional economic issues. After your speech, Franz Gatzweiler has kindly agreed to do a discussion opening. And mind you, this is a lecture in the series which we do together with United Nations University here in Bonn on risks and uncertainty for development. You will speak about vulnerable people, vulnerable states, redefining the development challenge. I ask for a round of applause for our distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Joachim, for a gracious introduction. I'm happy to see that the average age of economists is falling dramatically. We now have aspiring economists in the front row who might be 11 years old, 10 years old. Huh? It's never too soon to start. Genau? Yeah. Good. I'm required to use PowerPoint these days, right? I dislike it passionately, but everybody does it. So I will do a little bit of it, but I much prefer, I'm a little old-fashioned, and I prefer to talk to people. So that puts me in the minority these days, I understand that. I promise to speak slowly, so if English is your third or fourth language, I promise to be helpful to you. Yeah, I've worked on Sudan, and now probably going to be working in South Sudan. So Sudan, South Sudan, and Iraq. I worked in South Africa back in the 90s, so I tell people I specialize in problem economies. and South Sudan is a seriously problem economy. I was opposed to the divorce. I think the split with the North was a mistake. And I said, if people like Pakistan and India, they're going to love Sudan and South Sudan. And now, guess what? We have two seriously dysfunctional economies in a dangerous part of Africa. There is no hope for either one of them, I fear. But that's not the topic here. The topic here is to suggest to you that it's time for a new development catechism, or a new development model, or a new development approach to deal with the fragile economies and political structures in the Middle East and Africa. The urgent challenge of the day requires that we think seriously about how the development problem is problematized and how we go about doing it. The focus, I insist, must turn from growth and fighting poverty to addressing the problems of vulnerable people and vulnerable states. So I will describe for you what I mean by that. And my appeal, and the point I make in the book that just came out last week by that title, is that if we don't start to focus our attention on people and vulnerable states, we will, in 25 years, look back and find that nothing much good has happened. It's necessary to recall the animating idea of development assistance that grew out of the Bretton Woods agreements following World War II. It's the ones that set up the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations Development Program. Those are the Bretton Woods organizations. And the defining idea there was convergence. With financial and technical assistance from the relatively developed nations of the industrialized North, I will call it, those countries in the agrarian South would gradually achieve economic and social development. In pursuit of this outcome, the history of development assistance has seen a serial progression of imperatives: import substitution, infant industries, appropriate technology, structural adjustment, microfinance, sustainable development, the Washington Consensus, eliminating corruption, and now, sadly, the Millennium Development Goals. Sadly, because, I will tell you in a minute, there are problems with that. The hope has always been, with the right kind of help, the division between rich and poor, industrial and agrarian, North and South, would gradually disappear. And all of these disparities would be harmonized. It would require good governance, but don't worry, the rich countries could show you how to do that too. Now, if I can get this thing page down, maybe. Yeah. So, here's the convergence program. Now, the data I have only go back to 1980. I could get data further back, but not on these clusters of countries. MENA, that's Middle East and North Africa. OECD, the OECD countries. SSA, you know what that is, Sub-Saharan Africa. Despite the very best efforts and billions of dollars of foreign assistance, over 50 years of concerted development assistance, I think, has failed to produce convergence, unless you can see in this green line and the blue line something that I can't see. Doesn't look like convergence to me. That's per capita GDP, purchasing power parity in current dollars. So I say, what convergence? Figure 1 provides graphic evidence that the convergence agenda has been a comprehensive failure. With these disappointing results from so much money and international attention, the better part of wisdom suggests that perhaps Albert Einstein was right. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We've been doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for different results. I don't see that we've got it. There are now compelling economic and moral arguments, to say nothing of the dangers of persistent political unrest, to suggest that the current approach is not working. Many international political problems can be better understood and more easily fixed if the focus of international development can be shifted away from stimulating GDP and from, quote, fighting poverty. Development assistance must now be refocused on the vexing problems and challenges that face vulnerable people and vulnerable states. The vulnerable state is Pakistan. The vulnerable state is Sudan, South Sudan. The vulnerable state is Libya, Tunisia, Morocco. Those are vulnerable states. I hope I haven't offended anybody by leaving your country out. But vulnerable states ought to grasp our attention. Development assistance must now be refocused on these problems. More seriously, the pursuit of convergence makes no allowance for nation-states in much of Africa and the Middle East that have minimally comprehensive governance, not government, governance. Vast areas of meager economic potential in much of this region have not been understood by development economists in terms of the absence of a coherent state that could reach into the corners of these artificially designed colonial artifacts and provide governance in exchange for taxation and for the creation of what we might call the citizenship bargain. I can elaborate on that if you wish. The colonial history of this troubled region, whose overriding purpose was the aggressive extraction of people, called slaves, or natural resources, timber, oil, ivory, minerals. That history holds important implications for the idea of development. A focus on vulnerability starts from the premise that the underlying causal structures and processes of these economies are not coherent. That is the reason why these economies are on such bad trajectories. People and nation states are vulnerable because the economy is not set up to be responsive and to be adaptive. In many settings, post-colonial governments have continued the extraction of economic surplus, with the only difference being that the economic rents now being grabbed by indigenous leaders and their helpers stay there rather than coming to Europe. The ironic expression for this problem is often put as same car, different driver. With the deadline for achieving the Millennium Development Goals nearly upon us, it cannot be claimed that many of the poorest countries will be able to show much progress at all. And the reasons are obvious. There is no strategic vision, and there is no causal structure to the Millennium Development Goals. They represent a catalog of symptoms that are somehow to be rectified. If failure is indeed the result, many years and billions of dollars of foreign development assistance will have been wasted. It is too easy to blame the countries in which this lavish activity has been concentrated. Less frequently do we ask whether the logic and the approach of contemporary development assistance is itself flawed. I say we must shift attention away from fighting poverty. If the countries under discussion here are to be rescued from comprehensive political and economic fragility, a new development approach must start now. Economic coherence, seems to me, is the coin of the realm. Only then can the dual crises of vulnerable people and vulnerable states be remedied. The idea of poverty and the fight against it dominates the development discourse. This is a quote from the World's website. I've underlined and italicized and bolded fighting poverty. The World Bank fights poverty. Good for them. The literature is full of studies on poverty. There is a large and dubious literature on poverty traps. International donors claim that their reason for being is fighting poverty, and there are many, many measures of it. You know them all. The number of people living on less than some amount per day, and so on. We have a poverty industry. Relative poverty, absolute poverty. In 2008, when cereal prices rose, it was said that even more families slipped into poverty. Well, if they were selling grain, I don't know if they slipped into poverty if prices were higher for the grain they sold, but that's beside the point. There's income poverty, expenditure poverty, asset poverty, poverty traps, fractal poverty traps. It goes on and on and on. And it makes us feel good to say that we are fighting poverty. The current diagnostics in development is called growth diagnostics. The focus on growth is to reassure the donors that those who provide them with funding, because growth is a central organizing principle of those countries that pay for the donor for the development assistance. So it resonates with countries that fund development assistance. And a constant emphasis on growth makes us all imagine that the day will come when development assistance will no longer be necessary. Convergence will eliminate poverty. With convergence, formerly poor countries will no longer be poor. When this happy day arrives, the elaborate structure and expensive donor assistance won't be necessary. Convergence will have put the donors out of business, and the financial commitments now expected from the wealthy countries, small though they are on a percentage basis, will no longer be necessary. The political appeal of the convergence agenda is precisely in the expectation that countries will someday graduate, and therefore development assistance won't be needed. The logic of convergence stresses economic growth as the assured means to eliminate poverty, while the logic of fighting poverty enables donors to work on a variety of programs concerning poor people. The direct assistance to the poor, it is assumed, will launch them into the market and then produce economic growth. This strategy requires two presumptions, neither of which I find critical. The first presumption is that growth, measured as an increase in per capita GDP, will lift people out of poverty. The persistence of poverty and hunger among 20 to 23% of the world's inhabitants suggests that this presumption is not tenable. To take an obvious example, large deposits of oil, discovered and subsequently exported, increase GDP. When this larger output, I guess we should call it, is divided across the same population, it sure looks like per capita GDP has gone up, and you may think that some people have been lifted out of poverty. However, when household surveys are done, we often find that that has not been the case at all. If you're familiar with the economic strategies and outcomes in places such as Equatorial Guinea, Guinea-Conakry, Nigeria, even Botswana, you'll know what I mean. The second presumption is that programs to fight poverty play a significant role in bringing individuals and households into sustainable relationship with promising market activity. And this engagement, therefore, will yield increases in per capita GDP. This presumption is also difficult to support. I submit that convergence does little to solve poverty, and fighting poverty does little to bring about convergence, and we certainly didn't see much convergence on that earlier slide. Countries advance economically and socially when economic processes are coherent. And I will explain and describe that to you in a moment. The standard approach does not produce economic coherence. Both poverty and the absence of growth are mere symptoms of economies that do not cohere. Cohere means to fit together and to work. It's a fancy word for work. Okay? Development assistance must turn its attention to this economic process. An economy is always in the process of becoming. Okay? An economy is always in the process of becoming. That makes sense to you? Every day, it's different from what it was yesterday. It is always becoming. It is an organic, living machine, in a sense. Although I'm not sure I like that. Machine. The concept of economic coherence urges us to focus attention on how that inevitable process of becoming is going to unfold. There are two possible trajectories to overgeneralize a bit. One trajectory is dynamically adaptive, while the other one is downwardly asymptotic. Okay? Those countries we classify as poor are on a downwardly asymptotic trajectory. They are down and scraping along the bottom. Their poverty is not the interesting event in our engagement with them. Rather, our engagement with such countries is interesting because they possess internal characteristics that render them downwardly asymptotic, and it is that we must work on. Poverty is but a symptom of dysfunction, and dysfunctional economies do not cohere. Dynamic economies have a property that I call economic coherence. Dynamic economies possess a political structure and governance processes that allow national leaders, if they wish, to confront and rectify problematic situations as they arise. And problems do arise, don't they? Every week there's a new problem. A coherent economy has three essential attributes. There is first what I will call official curiosity. Official curiosity. This means that leaders and a majority of the citizens are engaged with, rather than fearful of, the future. That's official curiosity. Official curiosity serves to pull the nation forward. Its leaders are curious about the unfolding of economic processes. They wish to understand them. They wish to get out in front of them, harness them, control them. That's official curiosity. Second, a coherent economy is characterized by what I will call fiscal involution. Involution is a fancy word that means turning in on itself. Involution. Okay? Clifford Geertz, the great anthropologist, defined the economy of Indonesia as highly involuted, meaning that all of the niches had been filled by arrangements and rules and structures and protocols. That's involution. Okay? Fiscal involution is the complete financial connectivity that links means to ends. While official curiosity pulls a nation forward, fiscal involution enables that motion. And I mentioned earlier the tax bargain. Tax bargain is part of the fiscal involution. Many governments ignore their citizens because the citizens don't pay taxes, and therefore the citizens have no legitimate claim on the good behavior of the government. So the tax bargain, by which individuals agree to pay taxes and governments agree to provide services to the citizens, that's the tax bargain. And that's what I call fiscal involution. Okay? Ask me about this later. Press me on it, because you may not be convinced, and I want to hear why. Finally, a coherent economy is informationally dense. But you've never heard informational density before. Informationally dense. With high information density, scattered atomistic participants, economic agents, can quickly see and form contentful expectations about a wide range of arbitrage possibilities. Economists would refer to an economy of efficient markets as one that is informationally dense. There is information everywhere. You want to make a living, you want to do a product, you want to get a job, there's information out there. Information density is important. So, coherent economies are officially curious, fiscally involuted, and informationally dense. Let me show you one. Here we see an economy consisting of four elements. On the left we have what I call the data, in the middle the institutional context, then we have markets, that's what the economists all study markets, then we have outcomes. Okay? On the far left, data consists of the current endowments. Do you have minerals? What is the technology structure in this economy? What kind of personal wealth exists? so on. Okay, that's the data of an economy. Stock and quality of the technology, what have you. These aspects set the stage. They set the stage for economic processes. If you're Haiti, you don't have much of any of this. If you're Haiti, you don't have much of this. If you're Somalia, you don't have much data in my model. No, no wealth, minimal technology, endowments, all of that is missing. That's the data. These attributes are given and cannot be changed in the short run. Here we find the factors that both enable economic processes and that impel them forward. If a nation's citizens have no wealth, no savings, if there are few natural resources, if the stock of technology is old, has not been maintained, there cannot be much hope. The process of moving forward is then mediated by what I call the institutional context, the structure of markets, consumer preferences, and several varieties of transactions costs. The costs of gaining information about market opportunities, there's my information density thing. The costs of negotiating contracts so that those opportunities might be realized, and the cost of enforcing those contracts once they have been completed. And many of you know that in the countries from which you come, transactions costs represent an enormous deadweight loss on economic activity. Finding good market opportunities, contracting for those opportunities, and enforcing those contracts, extremely expensive. So the institutional context determines how the data is used once we get to the stuff that is usually of interest to economists, which is the market. The institutional context can be thought of as the pre-market setup that allows market processes to work or not. If the institutional context is conducive to efficient market processes, then the economy will begin to work well. And over on the far right, GDP will be high, prices will be low, quantities, right? All those great outcomes if this process works well. And then if you have good outcomes over there, you see you get feedback here, technical change, you get investments perhaps in natural resources, you get endowments going up, and that is the becoming process of an economy that is coherent. Okay? So there are two general sources of poor economic performance. One is the data, I've already talked about that, and one is the institutional context. Markets don't work in a vacuum. Markets are just places where buyers and sellers come together. Okay? And they can't reach a good, efficient bargain if transactions costs are so high that no bargain is possible. Markets are information generating systems. Have you ever thought of a market in that way? The only value of a market is that it gives off signals. That's all markets do. Okay? They give off signals. And those signals we call prices, and quantities. That's what markets do. So what we want is information generating processes that guide individual activity. That information, the prices and quantities, what I've got over here, that information becomes an input to somebody who wishes now to engage the market, because today's prices are the result of yesterday's market transactions. More correctly, the prices at this moment are the result of transactions that took place just a moment ago. So when you enter a market, the price that's there itself is data from a prior transaction. Economies are coherent when the information content of market signals leads to efficient allocated decisions. I won't bore you with that because you know what prices are. Good signals are clear, bad signals have noise. Noisy signals are of no use to an entrepreneur. They are of no use to a farmer because they are not contentful. They do not contain useful, actionable information. And many of the economies in which I work, and perhaps from which you come, have market signals which contain little information. What they contain is lots of noise. And noisy markets are not helpful. Noise obscures market operation. A well-functioning market economy, therefore, is the result of a persistent and ongoing process of creating legal arrangements and decrees from courts about what can and cannot be done, who may do it, who may not do it, what have you. That's what a coherent economy requires. The aggregate implication of vulnerability is economic incapacity to accomplish what it is that economies are supposed to do. Let me show you slide 3. Looks a lot like slide 2, but it isn't, because what we have here in my awkward, cartoonish sort of style is a way to try to show you that when you have economic incoherence, information that comes out of this box is flawed, full of noise. It does not lead to coherent institutional arrangement, leads to bad market outcomes, and so on. This is my cartoon effort to drive home to you what I mean, the difference between coherence and incoherence. I want to turn now to what I call the diagnostic imperative. The standard approach when donors engage a developing country is to prepare what the World Bank calls a poverty reduction strategy paper. I told you all they care about is poverty. So they create a poverty reduction strategy paper, usually about this thick, and it will name hundreds of issues, initiatives that have been tried, that might be tried, and so on. For the most part, this PRSP could be thought of as a framework document. So some new bank official arrives as the country bank representative, I don't mean to pick on the World Bank, in some place, and the first place she looks is this PRSP to see what's going on here. And it looks like a catalog. Mixture of problem statements, promising initiatives, general guidelines, and maybe some pressing issues. Now, I understand that this document is constructed to be honestly reflective of the wishes of the national government. So you want to understand this thing as a negotiated document between the donor community and the government. Unfortunately, this PRSP is not a plausible strategy document. And this is precisely the problem. Development assistance goes forward without a strategy, despite its name as a poverty reduction strategy. It is a large menu of possibilities. In the jargon of the trade, it is a shelf of projects, and therein lays its flaws. The fundamental challenge in dealing with vulnerable people and vulnerable states cannot be addressed by massive documents that mention hundreds of problems, yet fail to offer strategic guidance to the donor community or to a national government concerning exactly which tasks are most essential and most urgent to get the economy moving. And that's why I say if we focus on poverty, our attention is not on getting the economy moving, it is on poverty. And that's the wrong place to focus attention if you want to get the economy to work. This is where what I call constraints diagnostics. And constraints diagnostics focuses attention on the real constraints in an economy, rather than the resulting price effects that might emerge from those constraints. Now, you might think I'm drawing a very fine distinction here, but it's fundamental. Our economic tendency is to look at prices and to look at costs. And I remind you that prices and costs are simply artifacts, signals of a market process that may, in fact, be working badly. That's why the country is poor. So why would we attach any significance to the price signals from an incoherent economic system? I'm going to quote my good friend Joseph Schumpeter. You didn't know he was my friend, did you? Joseph Schumpeter, I think considered the father of development economics. Is that safe, Joachim?
Yeah, you
Okay.
talk about the Bonn professor.
That's right, that's right.
You're
Good.
talking.
It's okay, yeah?
Uh-huh.
All right, Schumpeter. He said, when we succeed in finding a definitive causal relationship between two phenomena, our problem is solved if one which plays the causal role is non-economic. Shocking. Huh? When we succeed in finding a definite causal relationship between two phenomena, our problem is solved if one of them, which plays a causal role, is non-economic. Schumpeter, the consummate economist, is saying, you haven't explained anything until you get outside of your economic model. Shocking, huh? Why do you want to become an economist after all? Let me say, he continues, we have then accomplished what we as economists are capable of in the case in question, and we must give place to other disciplines. If, on the other hand, the causal factor is itself economic in nature, we must continue our explanatory efforts until we, now this is old translated English, and must continue our explanatory efforts until we ground upon a non-economic bottom. Ground upon a non-economic, means until we hit ground, huh? But what we hit can't be economic, it has to be something else. You have to get outside of economics to understand economic processes. You may object to this, so fight me later on if you wish. Schumpeter notes, I believe correctly, that the quest for economic flaws in an economy cannot end when we have found some other economic fact or phenomenon. It is not enough to claim that interest rates are high because of the high risk borne by lenders. That merely begs the question as to why lenders are bearing high risks. What are those prior reasons? Transport costs are not high because of bribes and delays along corridors. Those bribes and delays are themselves the effect of something else. What? What is it? One must get outside of the artifacts of the economic system and its context-dependent signals, prices, if we are to find the ultimate rather than the proximate cause of economic dysfunction. Only ultimate causes can count as legitimate reasons for economic incoherence. The ultimate cause of flawed economic performances are to be found in the real attributes of a dysfunctional system. Those real attributes might be bad roads, missing bridges, lack of safe water, high chronic morbidity, frequent electricity outages, a frozen, choked land market, lack of diesel fuel for trucks, warehouse security problems, the theft of goods along the highway, old and degraded truck fleet, persistent shortages of gasoline and oil, few vehicle repair facilities, constant shortage of parts, you name it, you know the list, you've lived it. These are the real impediments to a well-functioning economy. Market signals are mere artifacts of these real causes. I like to say, and I hope it can be understood in this audience, I like to say, if you think prices come from markets, you show yourself capable of believing that milk comes from bottles. Get it? Comes from. You think prices come from markets, you show yourself capable of believing that milk comes from bottles. Does milk come from bottles? Or cartons, or plastic, or cardboard? Well, eventually, we're really interested in where milk starts, not where it ends up. To illustrate this constraints diagnostics, and I'm almost through here, I want to share with you a recent experience. I was, as Joachim mentioned, I was recently involved in Iraq. Now, in Iraq, I refused to go, or at least I should say my wife refused to let me go. So I set up shop in Amman, Jordan, which is a wonderful place to work. It's right next door to Iraq. But I had a team in Baghdad I wouldn't go there. But this team, I was hired to design a development strategy for Iraq. And so I want to share with you what we did, and it's what I call constraints diagnostics. An analysis of these constraints starts with a general summary of the situation in the country as captured by the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, FAO, whatever. So with a shelf of documents, you go into Iraq and there's a shelf of documents about this high by all sorts of experts that have been there over the last 5 years telling you what Iraq needs to do to become economically whatever. Okay? Well, our first task was to synthesize that documentary record and to distill out of it what we thought the salient constraints were, or the salient reasons why the Iraqi economy does not work. From these assessments, it is possible, it was possible, and we did this, to identify 5 to 8 or 9 critical economic activities, you may wish to think of them as sectors or subsectors, that seem to present serious impediments to the functioning of the economy, or in the Iraqi case, to the recreation of an economy that has been destroyed by 22 years of Stalinist stuff under Saddam Hussein, and then 8, 10, 12 years of war, okay? 35 years of serious dysfunction for a variety of reasons. The Iraqi economy used to be really good a long time ago. So the question is, how to get it back? How to lift it up off the ground? So, our job was to identify which activities or sectors seem to stand in the way of the resuscitation, revitalization, rehabilitation of the Iraqi economy. And that means one must look for systemic activities. A systemic activity would be water supply, sanitation services, electricity, retail gas and oil, transport services, banking, credit, communications, right? You guys know this. If you think about what it is that keeps an economy down, that's the list, okay? Those things aren't there, or they're there and they do not work. If you don't get those things fixed, the economy can't function. So these systemic activities, systemic meaning they are system, right, represent the necessary conditions for, shall I say, creating economic coherence to get this Iraqi economy going. And I will tell you, I worked in a lot of countries, and the Iraqi economy is no different from most other economies that I've encountered in the world. It has a different recent history, but the problems are the same in Iraq as I encounter in Sudan, South Sudan, Ghana, other places. Okay? A second set of economic activities are those that show growth potential, job creation. The diagnostic team then must identify 3, 4, 5 of these things that represent hope, possibility to generate quick payoff from work. I call those the growth centers. The selection of these growth centers must be based on the likely importance of that activity to the country's economic future, the potential impact of policy reform in that sector on larger aspects in the economy, and the extent to which that constraint spills over and constrains others. It's obvious if the transport sector in a country doesn't work, everything is hampered by this. No? So what we want to look to is the connectivity between long-haul truck transportation and agriculture, repair parts, consumer goods, fresh vegetables, what have you. We must also look at the feasibility of removing those constraints through target investment and policy reform. This diagnostic exercise must focus attention on those activities that currently impose the greatest harm. If you want to think of it in a linear programming frame, we're looking for the highest shadow price on a set of constraints in this maximization problem. The removal of these binding constraints would pay large dividends. Once the most important dysfunctional activities have been identified, the diagnosis must then focus on interacting with participants in those activities and other local experts to understand the nature of those constraints. Okay? This means, surprisingly, that the economist and the team might have to sit down with truck drivers, might have to sit down with farmers, might have to sit down with the guys who run the port, might have to sit down and talk to real people rather than getting data from the IMF and the World Bank. Can you imagine actually sitting down in a room with 7 truck drivers and saying, hey guys, what's your problem? My God, they'll give you 2 days worth of problems. Okay? They'll tell you everything. They have nothing to hide. They don't hide. You don't want to ask them why, because their diagnostic causal structure is not quite as good as yours. But you surely want to ask them, why can't you run your trucks between Baghdad and Basra in less than 5 days? Okay? It's only 300 kilometers or whatever it is. You ask them that. You'd be surprised. And then feed them a little lunch. You'd be surprised what they tell you. Or you meet with a bunch of construction companies that are dying to build houses. They haven't built a house in Iraq for 25 years. Can you imagine the multi-family structure that this creates? Children, grandchildren, all living in hot, crowded facilities. You talk to the construction industry about what keeps them from building more houses, more of them. You'll get an earful. That's what we mean by constraints, diagnostics. Okay? Out of that, what you do is you identify 2 or 3 of the most serious constraints, and those become the things that you want your development assistants to focus on. Okay? Let me try to wrap this up. When we're trying to create economic coherence, what we're interested in is eliminating the causes. And those causes are instrumental to eliminating constraints in particular activities. So eliminating the cause is instrumental to eliminating a constraint. Eliminating a constraint is instrumental to creating economic coherence in certain activities: transport, housing, greenhouse agriculture, tourism. Creating economic coherence in certain activities is instrumental to enhance economic productivity and employment growth in that sector. We're not trying to grow the Iraqi economy by magic. What we're trying to do is find those constraints that hold it down. If you take care of those constraints, growth will take care of itself. Governments cannot cause growth. Governments cannot cause growth. You hear me? If I did it a 3rd time, would you like to hear it a 3rd time? 4th time? You get it? Governments cannot cause growth. Governments can set the table, the conditions, the preconditions for growth. And in doing so, they will create economic coherence. So, new economic policies are the necessary means by which coherence is created. Policy reform, which is what this is all about, is a continual process of institutional refinement, tinkering with the rules of the game, as it were, tinkering with taxes on fuel, tinkering on retail markets for gasoline, tinkering on pricing for electricity, tinkering around the edges, getting the capital structure right, and then working around the edges to get the system so that it will function. I'm going to close with just a brief comment here. As long as the development problem is driven by the quest for growth as a means to solve poverty, the entire activity is held hostage by some mysterious black box called good or bad policies. To put the problem in causal terms, these policies comprise the transmission mechanism that must convert development assistance in its various forms into measurable evidence of growth and poverty reduction. Unfortunately, this transmission mechanism is one that defies meaningful assessments of its instrumental properties. The standard development approach comes dangerously close to the unfortunate position that good policies bring about good outcomes and bad policies do not. This ironic paradox of development provides the best evidence that it's time for a new approach. The essential alternative is one that cannot be defeated by bad policies. Development assistance must be recrafted in a way that it is impossible for bad policies to stand between implementation of something and their intended effects. Careful work in creating economic coherence where dysfunction now rules is the necessary first step. This is how the international development community must redefine the development challenge. Thank you very much.
Franz, your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And let me respond by turning around your causality again. First, I very much like the idea of creating a functional economy which is coherent, responsive, and adaptive by allowing information flows, signaling, transmission mechanisms, like you put it, and basically policy process, and thereby also making not only markets work well, but also societies more democratic or politically mature. At least that's how I understood you. You're suggesting to look at fundamental functioning and ultimate causes instead of muddling around with symptoms like growth and poverty alleviation. But the first big question is coherence. You ask what coherence, and I would ask coherence for whom and how much, and especially at which systemic scale. How do we qualify an economic system to be coherent? By which values and by which measurements? Isn't the question rather, for whom does the system work, and for whom is it coherent, and for whom not? If the system works for me, I have not interest in creating coherence for my competitor, of course. That is definitely the attitude of those who benefit from the many dysfunctions of economies. Now, how coherent are developed nations? You told us that Iraq is a dysfunctional economy, and others as well, but where are the coherent economies? Where are the developed or the industrialized economies? And why are they more coherent? When we look at their ecological footprint, for example, if they have not achieved coherence and convergence, who has? If growth is no longer a success indicator, and I agree that it is a problematic success indicator, what is the yardstick for measuring progress towards convergence? You propose a method of constraint diagnostics, which is based on complex systems understanding of the economy. The approach very much resembles our understanding of marginality and dynamic systems approach, which we have tested in several countries and with different stakeholders. And from that we know that it is extremely difficult to define the boundaries and the scales at which systems work and subsystems, and as well as positive and negative feedback loops within and between system variables. I mention that because you also talked about systems and systemic activities. Sometimes systems failure, that means dysfunctional economies, maybe, or what they bring forth, needs to be avoided, and sometimes failure is very necessary for renewal and for escaping traps. So are the failures sufficient to qualify those economic systems as dysfunctional or as incoherent? Or are those just hiccups of a system which actually works quite well? How much failure do we need to realize that fixing the economic compass for development is insufficient? That deeper structural change is necessary? So I think it is problematic in your diagnostic constraints approach to talk about one system which is perceived and one underlying causality. With such difficult questions in mind, it becomes clear that coherence is a feature which is difficult to define, detect, observe, and to measure, and therefore it's difficult or impossible to say when coherence has been achieved. Let me jump to the next big question, the relationship between growth and poverty, economic and political systems. You say that the focus on growth is the central organizing principle of industrialized or developed nations, and the logic of convergence says that growth is a means to eliminate poverty, and also that there is no guarantee that growth will alleviate poverty. Instead, convergence will eliminate poverty. But how much growth do we need before sufficient convergence is built to eliminate poverty? And then if we need growth to achieve convergence, why not take it as our prime goal for the time being, together with poverty alleviation, until we can invest in building convergence? So how do we build convergence with hungry people anyway? Some are always against coherence and aim at securing their property rights. Also by controlling information flows, transactions, and transmission channels, governments claim to secure social peace by limiting freedom of speech and thereby avoiding what you describe as making a system coherent and functional. So there are successful attempts to hinder coherence in order to achieve growth and development. Can creating economic coherence within established political patterns lead to corruption? The question here is, again, at which scale coherence is built, whether there can be self-reinforcing loops, positive feedback loops, which create filth, systems which do not prosper, do not develop. So my impression is that convergence and coherence require political and economic development to go hand in hand, and maybe that is what you're also saying. That means counter to what you suggest, that growth can and should be a valid goal, just as poverty alleviation can be, but economic and political development needs to be in balance and advance gradually. Not only economic systems must cohere, like you say, economic and social or political systems must cohere. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for your lecture, Dan, and for your discussion opening, Franz. In this room a week ago, we had a meeting of the German Economics Association, the branch of development economists. The topic, new coherence problems. Had an exciting panel discussion about that. In end of September, we will have in this room the ZEF International Advisory Board meeting, and on Thursday, September 27th afternoon, we will have here in this room a debate on the future of objectives in development and related coherence problems. So you're just here on the right time to fruitfully influence, I think, what is really a frontier discussion issue in development research, not just in development economics. Thank you for invoking Schumpeter. Who lived for a while down the street on what is called today Adenauer. Colleagues, I'm sure you have gathered questions and would like to challenge Professor Bromley. Feel free to get started with whichever points you would like to make. Yeah. One? Okay. Okay, we will start with you and follow later. Go ahead.
Yeah.
And tell Professor Bromley what your background is, who you are.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Safietou Sanfo, and I'm an economist. And I did my PhD at Sorbonne University, Paris 1. Yeah, I'm Francophone, I'm coming from Francophone country, so my English will be very long. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, for giving us a brief concerning fighting against poverty. And for my concern, you mentioned that creating economic coherence is means that involving economic growth. But the big question is how to do. This is my first question. And you mentioned also that talking about fighting poverty, World Bank is a vital and a source of financial and technical way. But I don't know, maybe you have some experience in the developing countries. I don't know, for my concerning, I think that there are sometimes some controversies between theoretically and practically side, because the World Bank sure is the institute who can help in the financial side, but there are also sometimes some measures and some conditions, and then the question, the big issue is how to do. Maybe in the national level, it will be maybe a kind of maybe open mind. We have to talk about, I don't know, pupils in the national, or talking about government who are decision makers. Because if I take, for example, the case of in Burkina Faso.
Make sure you ask a question and don't ask me
yeah, I would like.
I want to respond to a question.
Yeah, I would like to know if you're concerning if there are some controversies and how to do. Because theoretically, yes, World Bank is an institute and it can help. But in the practice, there are some measures. This is the big question, how to do.
And if you don't mind, we collect a few.
Yeah.
Mark?
Mark
And then
Müller.
I will ask in the middle ground, sitting colleagues from China and Malaysia, some big converting ones.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Mark Müller here from the Center for Development Research, also giving a class at the University on Developing Economics, where I also talk about Schumpeter and about the difference between proximate and fundamental causes of development. And perhaps, I'm not sure if I understood you correctly there. So you said that as a fundamental cause, you would, for instance, consider also the dire situation of status of streets, of the road infrastructure, was that correct? Mm-hmm. And we talked about exactly that with the students just the other day. And I told them, no, this is not a fundamental cause. Because you can immediately ask, so why is the road in a dire situation?
That's right.
And as long as you can immediately ask that question, you are not exactly there.
Yeah, good.
So that's what I told them.
That's
now
right.
you are saying something different. I'm afraid I'm telling the truth.
No, you're right. This is good. Yeah, we'll do this. Okay.
And here in the middle.
Thank you for your presentation. It's as far as I understand, that is the if you want to rebuild a country's economic. I mean, first of all, like a doctor to do a diagnosis to find out what problem behind the theory. I mean, find the cause which or the constraints in this development, economic development. That give me impression that the government should then to know how to build this economic coherence, and it's like once a government to know. It's like one know how to do it. Maybe they will find to build they have some institution context that most of all are done by government. And then it's like economic. Once economic of this country is set up, then maybe the economic will grow very well in the future, because if government is stable and they should know, they have experience how they begin and what the problem they have faced. But it's like the problem for me is like the South American, like Argentina. There's one of the time they develop, the economic is very good, and I think I don't know, maybe that economic currency is for Argentina is good, but then because the export substitution policy, then the economic goes down. So I don't know, is that a mistake of government? But like you say, if government know what they have done is right, then why they make mistake again?
Okay, there's a question. Good.
Well, why don't we leave it there for the first round of questions. If I may add, and forgive me if I go back to your figure 2, where is government in your economic coherence framework? I mean, amplifying the last question.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Is it Mark over here? Yeah. I want to take Mark. Can I call you Mark? Mark Muller, is that right? Yeah. All right. I want to take Mark's question first, because he's absolutely right. I cut it off too short. He's raised the endogeneity problem. He just says roads aren't bad by magic. Roads are bad because there's reason for bad roads. Fair enough? Why are roads bad? We know why roads are bad. So you don't, I don't mean that once you just find bad roads that's it, because as I said to you, the diagnosis starts with asking truckers why it takes them 4 days to drive 340 kilometers. And I said, don't ask them to diagnose why, just ask them what the constraints are, because they may not have good causal structures in their head. Okay? They may not know the model. But we first want to get from them what these constraints are. Then it is our job as analysts to figure out why the roads are bad. And there are a couple of alternative answers to that. One is the roads are bad because there's no financing for the Ministry of Roads. Roads might be bad because there's lots of money that goes into the Ministry of Roads, but she steals all of that money. Another one might be there's, so the point here is a good diagnostician does not stop once you have just found what Schumpeter would call a non-economic bottom. You want to keep digging. Right? This, I would like to call your attention to what Aristotle called diagnosis, and to what my favorite philosopher, other than some of the Germans, Charles Sanders Peirce, called abduction. I ask you to look up in a book on philosophy, abduction. Abduction is a process of generating hypotheses. Abduction, you've never heard of it, I know. You know deduction and induction. You know one of them is good and one is bad. You're never sure which is which. Now I'm telling you there's a third, abduction. Abduction is what philosophers call inference to the best explanation, or what Charles Sanders Peirce called the method of hypothesis. So when you find something, you want to dig and find the reason for it, and when you find the reason for it, you want to keep digging until you have sort of gone as far back as you possibly can. So, Mark, you're absolutely right. It was sloppy of me to say bad roads are where you want to stop, because it's not where you want to stop. But your diagnosis needs to start there, because the truckers, that's the reason they will say why it takes them 5 hours to get from Basra to Baghdad. Bad roads and criminals along the highway. Then we need to find out why are there criminals along the highway. We need to find out why the roads are bad. So I fully agree with you. Okay? Which I think then comes back to some of these other questions. I'm not interested in growth, and I'm not a fan of growth, and I think some of you thought that I was. Okay? I am not advocating growth. I said to you, if you take care of the problems, growth will take care of itself. Okay? Do you understand what that means? If you take care of the constraints, growth will take care of itself, because the self-interest of individuals will find arbitrage possibilities and so on. So if you create an economic structure in which signals are meaningful, then agents will know how to take self-interest of activity, and voila, growth will happen. I'm not interested in growth. Please. Does everybody hear me? I'm not interested. Look, if you have a market economy, and that seems to be what we have now, okay? Capitalism has won. Isn't that right? Okay? It's all over. It's the end of economic history. We now have the market. The market is triumphant. Huh? When we get through celebrating, we get down to hard work. A market requires a nexus between the owners of labor and the owners of capital. Fair enough? If that nexus doesn't work, you don't have a labor market, and you don't have jobs, and you don't have disposable income, and then you don't have growth. So I'm repeating myself. If you take care of the fundamentals, okay, growth will take care of itself. And if you don't think it's going fast enough, then you turn some dials on interest rates and other stuff. But the fundamental thing, which I find missing in most development economics, is an understanding of this essential nexus between the owners of capital and the owners of labor power. Okay? And if we don't focus on that, you can't have anything. Right? Do you understand me? I am not celebrating growth, Franz. Okay? And I'm not saying America has it right and Somalia doesn't. I want to be very clear about that. I'm working in Sudan. 75–80% of the people in South Sudan don't have anything in their pocket. Get it? Nothing. I mean nothing. Not just a little. They have nothing. All right? Now, do we like that happy state? I don't think so. I doubt that they do. Okay? So the question is, what do you do? What do you do about it? So, where's government in these institutions? Yeah, I was sort of silent on that. Who sets up the structure of a market? Who defines property rights? Who defines the rule of law? Okay? Government is absent in most of these countries. Absent. John Mellor used to say, you go 30 miles beyond the capital city and you see nothing. Right? Nothing. That's what I meant. What we're missing in I'll use the term, but I refuse to use it. Failed states. I hate this term. Please don't tell anybody I use it. Okay? These aren't failed states. They're absent states. There's a difference. Failed means you tried and couldn't do it. These states haven't tried. There's a difference. Okay? So, the institutional structure is missing, it's perverse, it's dysfunctional. So, the dilemma is, guys, we have to start somewhere. Okay? Because, as I said, there was a pile of documents this high about what's wrong with Iraq's economy. I read most of it. I stopped counting when I got up to about 200 problems. What good does the president of a country and the minister of finance get when a development expert says, welcome, you have 200 serious problems. What we need more than anything is the first 3 that might be tackled. First 3. So I read all the macroeconomists talking about Iraq. They were complaining about all of the employees in Iraq on the government payroll. That's an effect of something. Okay? But they like to make it sound as if the government is stupid and corrupt. But if you think diagnostically, you understand, hey, there is no private sector in Iraq, so how could it be possible that there would be jobs in the private sector? There is no private sector. So the government of Iraq has two options. One is to put a bunch of people on the government payroll and tell them to stay home while they get the economy going. And the other is not to put them on the payroll and face even more murder, chaos in the streets. Okay? You're the king of Iraq. Which option do you pick? I'd put a lot of people on the government payroll. Okay? And I tell the IMF to go away right now. Get lost. We got a more serious, urgent problem. You see, it's a sequencing thing. Franz, some of your questions want me to admit that the industrialized world is going off in the wrong direction. And I'd rather not do that. I'd rather not, because I'm not sure it pertains to what I'm talking about here. And please don't get me wrong. I do not believe that the only trouble with Somalia is that it doesn't look more like Sweden. That is not what I'm saying. Okay? And I think a lot of the development stuff is motivated by the idea. The only trouble with Sudan is it's not more like, what's another S country? Sweden, I picked on them on Switzerland. Okay? So, you know, the point here is you've got 2 billion people with nothing in their pocket and not very much to eat, embedded in economies that do not work. And all I meant by my chart was that 30, 40 years of the old stuff hasn't really seemed to help sub-Saharan Africa. And it certainly hasn't helped Pakistan. Okay? And I'm looking for a way to help Pakistan. And I'm not going to do it by macro stuff to help Pakistan grow. I'm not going to do it by helping Sudan or South Sudan grow by turning a few dials. So I think it's a long answer, but I hope I've touched on some of this.
I think we have 6 minutes left. We can do one more quick round of questions and answers. Let me start with 2 remarks. The world is converging quickly, has been over the past decades on a critical indicator of life expectancy. So your curves would look rapidly converging if you had plotted not GDP per capita, but life expectancy at birth. I think that's pretty relevant as a development indicator. So putting up GDP there and tossing it over your paper tiger, maybe you may like to argue a bit about that. Second remark, overcome constraints, growth will take care of it. Question, how do you deal with externalities of growth? And the whole big global commons agenda, which sometimes also hits developing countries. So I don't think growth takes care of itself if you fix the infrastructure, etc. list. Maybe you want to come back to that little question. 1, 2, be shorter than me.
I'll be very short. I was in the development industry for the last 25 years as a consultant, so I'm not from the academic sphere here.
Welcome.
Yeah, and I can go with almost everything you're saying. I just want a very straight answer to what are the 3 main strategic interventions in Sudan, and how much thinner is your strategy compared to PRSP?
Okay.
I found it very interesting that you mentioned, forgot to mention where I'm from. I'm student assistant here at Center for Development Research, and I found very interesting that you mentioned the need for more coordination of projects in development assistance. So, like when you do projects in a country, that you coordinate them with other development agencies, so that it's not like what I've had the feeling sometimes that development agencies are more opponents to each other, that they're focused on their reputation more than on helping the country. So what would you propose? What is needed to coordinate those efforts? Is it like what kind of agency could do coordination of efforts worldwide?
Last one. Go ahead.
I'm Abdul Salam from Pakistan. I'm a student of development economics. In this economic coherence, you mentioned the preferences. Can you say something about the preferences of individual or government, how they form, and what's the role of government in shaping these preferences? And very short, like as you told, that what Pakistan needs in present to
I knew there'd be somebody from Pakistan in the room. Go ahead.
Ben?
First, I
Ben,
have a comment
Tanzania.
and a question. A comment, I
Just
think.
a question, we are running out of
Yeah,
time.
just a
Please.
question, please.
Okay.
I'm not good at answering comments. I may not be good at answering questions.
What if the solution, the primary solution in solving the constraints or creating the economic coherence involves either merging two post-colonial states or dividing one post-colonial states into two states?
Yeah, well, right, okay,
For example, in Tanzania,
yeah,
the
sure.
mainland, in Zanzibar, in Sudan.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, I could have drawn life expectancy, you're right, Joachim, life expectancy has converged. I find life expectancy a curious indicator because it can't much go above 75 or 77 or 82. So, you know, it's a definable thing, it's there, and good for us, or good for everybody. We brought life expectancy up. It may be a life spent in the same kind of horrible grinding poverty that people used to spend in when they died at the age of 48, so they're living longer. That is good, don't get me wrong. But life expectancy is a funny kind of indicator. Having said that, I happen to find the model that brought life expectancy to converge very compelling. And it may be noticed that the approach that I'm advocating is precisely the public health model that managed to get life expectancy up. So this is a public health model that I have shared with you, okay? Identify a target, identify the constraints, get focused on it, and do it. And I think life expectancy and infant mortality and maternal mortality and all those things, we made great progress on that. And I say, if economists would watch the way doctors and public health professionals deal in the developing countries, we might learn a thing or two. So that's my thought about that. Externalities from growth, of course. It looks like I feel like I have come across as an advocate for growth. And once again, I say, I'm not that. I'm not that. Okay? But getting a few jobs in Iraq or any jobs in South Sudan can be dealt with without the fear of generating the kind of externalities that we worry about. And on a less nice side of this is that those of us who are rich have to be very careful. Because we got rich by plundering the earth and exploiting people of color. And now that we are rich, if we say, time to worry about spaceship Earth, we are open to the charge that we got rich and now we're pulling up the lifeboat, the ladder to the lifeboat, and leaving everybody else to suffer. So, in my other life, I'm an environmental economist, so I'm very sympathetic to these concerns, but we have a moral dilemma. Okay? Enough of that. Sudan. What is needed in Sudan? You know what's needed in Sudan? A helicopter to fly over all of South Sudan and half of Sudan and dribble Sudanese dollars out the bottom of the helicopter. Just drop it. Okay? Just put it out there. That's what's needed. Guess what that is? That's called liquidity. Okay? After 20 years of civil war, there is no money in circulation in South Sudan. You put liquidity out there in the countryside, guess what people do with liquidity? They have a nasty habit of spending it. And when they spend it, they create jobs, you get a multiplier, and all of this good stuff goes. Do you think the World Bank would sign on to a program to fly helicopters over there and drop Sudanese pounds? I doubt it. That is the one thing that would do the most good. Just drop money.
Yeah.
Just give money. Wait a minute, I take it back. Don't give it to the men. Set up a plan where the money goes to the women. Make the women come into the local telegraph office and count the kids and hand out 10 Sudanese pounds for every child that woman has. And don't worry if she goes outside and brings in somebody else's children and gets another 10 or whatever. Don't sweat the small stuff. Get liquidity in the hands of women. That's the recipe. Donor coordination, preferences. I don't know. Look, we know that we're dealing with is colonial artifacts. Pakistan is a colonial artifact. It's the tragic result of a geographer gone crazy. Okay? And a bluff by our wonderful founder, perhaps. A bluff. Some people tell me that Ali Jinnah was bluffing, all right, in his dealings with, leaving that aside. We're dealing with cultural and geographic and historical colonial artifacts. And the first thing is the creation of an idea of nationhood. Whether we like it or not, development is an idea that transcends the nation state. Right? So there we have it. And these leaders, and I'll try to be polite, have done little to create the idea of nationhood. They've done a lot to create the idea of personhood and the cult of the personality. That's why I said same car, different driver. They're now raping their countries more aggressively than the Europeans ever dared to do. They can get away with it. So creating the idea of nationhood is a necessary condition, which then gets back to the question about preferences. Okay? So that's, I'm sorry, that might be too long. I don't know if I've answered everything. They're great questions. Thank you.
Ben, we did not invite you to answer some questions. We had invited you to give us a lecture of wisdom on new thinking in development and in development economics. And you marvelously delivered and stimulated thought. The big problems of development economic theory, I think, were clearly identified. But not only that, you gave us alternatives, which I think will shape the frameworks of a lot of research activities here at ZEF. I would like to thank you wholeheartedly also on behalf of our colleagues and hope to see you here again soon.
Thank you.